It's a really interesting opportunity to talk about challenges and opportunities for OER and OEP in the next decade. Obviously, the kind of long-term health of the field and of the community is something that I think about a lot. And some of these things may be things you've heard me say before, if you have heard me speak before or have followed my blog. And some of them are things that are new things that I'm thinking about and that I'm sharing for the first time here. So I'm really interested to hear everyone's feedback. I think we've preserved plenty of time for Q&A at the end. I will say, if you want to pull the slides up so that you can play the home version of the game, it's this bit.ly link here. And I've got it on the last slide as well. So if you don't get it from here, you can grab it off the last slide. If it turns out that after you've heard the talk, you still want to look at the slides, you'll have access to them. So I want to just make a brief prelude about collaborating. There's an apocryphal story about Isaac Newton sitting under the apple tree and seeing an apple fall, and that's what prompted his work originally on gravity. It turns out this is not an apocryphal story. This is a story that's recounted by a contemporary of his whom he told the story to directly. I never knew that before, and as I was preparing for this part of the presentation, I came across this quote, and I thought it would be fun to share, that Newton himself said that his notions of gravity were occasioned by the fall of an apple as he sat under a shady apple tree in a contemplative mood. And thinking about, Newton being able to start from that point and go on and do all the things that he did in the context of gravity, all the progress that he made there, it made me think about a new kind of course design. And so I want to propose to you all a new model of course that we could offer to students. And the example here would be Fundamentals of Gravity. And the prerequisites for this would just be, you need a Newton-like background in math and physics. You need a shady apple tree. And the duration of this course is 3 to 5 years. So you just have to be brilliant already, sit under a tree long enough, and then think and work on it quite a bit harder. And of course, every new course design proposal needs an endorsement. So here's an endorsement from Isaac Newton for this approach to learning about gravity. Now, of course, this is nonsensical. This would be a terrible way to teach someone about gravity, horribly inefficient, and no guarantee that they'll even end up in the right place. And thinking about this kind of joke of a course design, it made me think that the primary purpose of education, I think, is to increase the efficiency of learning. If somebody wanted to learn gravity on their own, they could go sit under an apple tree and they could spend a couple of years waiting for an apple to fall and being in the right mood and then taking what they already know and applying it to that and trying to drive that forward in a undirected, exploratory, discovery-based kind of way. But I think the reason that we come to college, that we go to school, that we have a teacher, that we work with instructional materials is that we're looking to be able to learn more and to learn more quickly. We don't want to have to figure out everything on our own. We want increased efficiency. And so, Newton is hearkening back to a story from long before his time when he said that if he's seen further, it's because he stood on the shoulders of giants. And I think that education really is this elaborate structure of how many people can we bring together? How can we structure that so that not only can you stand on the shoulders of people like we see some of these doing here, but you can actually stand on the upraised hands of people and see even further than the folks who came before you. And then we have a serious obligation to think about how do we help people get up onto our shoulders to be able to see even further down the road. But this idea of collaboration, I think it's particularly interesting when we think about education. The collaboration between subject matter experts and instructional design experts. And if we blow these out into a 2x2 kind of grid, because this is how we interpret the world, of course, is in 2x2 tables. I think we've all had that experience where we've been in a course with someone who had a great deal of subject matter expertise, but didn't know very much about instructional design or learning science. And in a situation like that, accurate information can be conveyed. But as a student, you can struggle to remember, understand, and apply it because it's presented accurately, but it's not presented in a way that's actually going to help you learn it. You can imagine something down in the other corner here as well, someone with say, someone with a master's degree in instructional design who teaching as an adjunct at the very last minute gets asked to teach an intro to chemistry course, and chemistry isn't their discipline. Well, they can come up with all kinds of very effective kinds of exercises, activities, things that they can have students engage in, but if they don't know the subject matter, the odds are pretty high that students are going to learn an inaccurate representation of the domain. So clearly the place we want to be is in this top right-hand corner, where there's subject matter experts and instructional design experts really collaborating to create material that's both accurate, but that's also asking students to engage in activities that really will promote their learning, so that student effort is really converted into learning the most efficient way it can be. So instead of taking 3 to 5 years to kind of figure out the basics of gravity, today you can do that in a weekend. And if you actually want to spend 3, 4, 5 years on it, standing on the shoulders of people who are standing on the shoulders of other people who are standing on their shoulders at a college or a university, in 4 years, you can go from simple machines to quantum mechanics, right? Because you have the help and support of people who have expertise and materials in which that expertise has been embodied. So this idea of collaborations isn't something new. Obviously, I'm not, this isn't the part that's innovative about this talk. Going all the way back to Herb Simon, if not before, people have been saying that improvement in post-secondary ed really requires converting teaching from a solo sport into more of a community-based research activity, where that community is comprised of at least 2 people, right? The subject matter expert and the instructional designer. That collaboration can be made even more fruitful if there are other people with other kinds of expertise participating, but I want to focus just on this part here at the beginning. Faculty and instructional designers need to talk to each other far more often, ask each other for help way more frequently, collaborate more effectively, and improve student learning more dramatically than we currently do. And for OER and OEP, just to start to make the transition here, I think the major challenges and opportunities over the next decade really pertain to, first, making sure that student learning remains our top priority and we don't take our eye off that ball. And 2, how we sustain and maintain OER over the long term. And that's really what I want to spend the majority of the time talking about today. Now, since I've said the word term, let's agree on terms for a minute. I'm going to start with OER and then I'll come to OEP in a few minutes. Everyone has their own definition of OER. God bless you. I love that you have your definition of OER. You keep using it. This is the definition that I'm going to use as I'm talking for the next hour today. And this is the definition that Creative Commons uses, that the Hewlett Foundation uses, that a number of organizations use. That OER are teaching, learning, and research materials that are either in the public domain or are licensed in a manner that provides everyone with free and perpetual permission to engage in the 5R activities. Right, so the key things here are that OER are teaching, learning, and research materials that are either in the public domain, which means they're not subject to copyright protection, or they're licensed under a particular kind of copyright license. In other words, their OER-ness is a function of their copyright. Either they're not protected by copyright or they're licensed under a particular kind of copyright license. One that gives us free and perpetual permission to engage in these 5 Rs. So let's say a word about the 5 Rs very quickly. The first R is retain. For a resource to be an open educational resource, you must have free and perpetual legal permission to make, own, and control your own copy of the resource. Not a streaming resource like a movie off of Netflix, not a streaming song like a song off of Spotify, but something that you can download your own copy. It doesn't delete itself off of your hard drive after 6 months. It doesn't have a password that times out. You must have permission to make and in perpetuity own and control a copy of the resource. Once you have that permission, then you can take your copy of the resource and you can revise, edit, adapt, modify it. You can remix it. You can combine it with other materials in order to create something new, like a mashup. You must have permission also to take either that original copy that you made or your revised copy or your remixed copy and use that publicly. We're not talking just about things where the classroom door is closed and no one can see and that makes it okay. You must have permission to make public use of the resource. And finally, you must have permission to let others download copies of your resource and do these same 5R kinds of things to them. If you have permission to engage in these 5R activities and you got those permissions for free, and those permissions are perpetual, then it's good to call that resource an open educational resource. And as I say OER throughout the remainder of my presentation, that's what I'm going to mean. So, 2 challenges for OER in the coming decade. First, one about sustaining and maintaining OER. And this one, I'm going to spend a little more time on this one because I think the logic of the argument is just slightly more complicated. The rest of the time will go faster as we hit the other points. But I wonder if you think, in the next decade, what are the biggest potential challenges that are going to face OER? What would you say? And I think at first blush, we might be tempted to say, well, commercial publishers are going to come after OER in this way or that way. And that's really the biggest threat. I actually want to propose to you that the biggest threat to OER over the next 10 years is us, is OER advocates. And specifically OER advocates who are advocating for what's called the ZTC degree, the zero textbook cost degree. Now, why on earth would I say that that is the single biggest potential challenge that OER will face going forward? Let me start with a little bit of history. Everybody loves history, right? 9 years ago, the very first of these, what was at that time called the Z degree, launched at Tidewater Community College here in the US. And that, they did that in a partnership with us, with Lumen Learning. So I know this history pretty well and was kind of involved in it firsthand. The idea here is that students who enrolled in Z degree courses would pay $0 for textbooks. And I think that's the part that everyone hears and everyone remembers. The part that people don't remember from the original Z degree work is that students paid $0 for textbooks because the institution took on the responsibility to pay for supporting technologies, supporting tools, faculty training, the things that needed to come together to make that project really be successful. And as the Z degree model got copied, it deteriorated, as copies frequently do, copies of copies. So that today's ZTC programs eliminate textbook costs for students, but they do that without kind of replacing that funding that goes to support tools and to support training. And I think because that's true, if you're really thinking about the long view, 10 years from now, where things could go, I think the ZTC model really does pose an existential threat to large-scale OER creators and maintainers, the people who are creating and maintaining the OER that are serving as content infrastructure for a lot of what is happening in the space. And if that's confusing, I think it's because we don't typically talk about the sustainability models that are used by these larger OER creators, revisers, remixers, maintainers. The creation of OER is typically funded by one-time grants. But updates and maintenance to OER are typically funded by ongoing revenues. And what I mean when I say that is if we just take a couple of examples of people that I think fit this category of really providing kind of infrastructure level OER to the whole field. Grants fund the creation of freely accessible and openly licensed OER that are shared on the websites of all these organizations. That's one-time money. It pays for the creation of the OER. But how do each of these organizations fund the maintenance, the upkeep, the updates of their OER? They pay for those things with product revenues, right? So in OpenStack's case, it's selling printed copies. It's selling their Rover math system or their Tutor homework system. Or OpenStax has partnerships with a number of technology partners that when you adopt an OpenStax textbook and their partner's technology, their partner passes some of the money that you pay to the partner directly back through to OpenStax, right? OLI has a courseware model where they wrap courseware services around their OER, and Lumen has something very similar. But in each of these cases, there's one-time money that's used to create the OER, but maintenance and updates come from revenue. So when you adopt a zero textbook cost policy and you make it a matter of policy that students cannot spend money on materials for their courses, you take away the ability for an organization to generate the kind of revenue that's used to do maintenance and update. So we can still go get grants for new OER creation, but now ZTC cuts off this notion of revenue that can support updates and support maintenance. And I would encourage you to take a look around the province, take a look around the country, take a look around the world, and look for grants where you can get grant money to make updates and maintenance and improvements to OER. And they're not there. So I think it's an interesting question to ask, what happens, what would happen when the organizations whose primary focus are on creating and maintaining these big infrastructure kind of OER pieces, and by that I mean, an OpenStax textbook, an OLI course, a Lumen course, something where $500,000 or $1 million is invested in the creation of a single set of materials. What happens when that just stops working? So for example, if you've been in the field for a while, you'll remember 10, 12 years ago, when when Flat World Knowledge abandoned all of their open textbooks, orphaned them overnight, stopped providing any updates or maintenance to them. And today they're just in a shambles. There have been a couple of projects here and there that have tried to update them, but there's nobody that's really responsible for them. There's certainly no long-term funding stream for that work to happen. What would happen if Open Textbooks had to orphan all of its open textbooks if OpenStax had to orphan its open textbooks in the same way that Flat World Knowledge did? And I think the path that we're on right now, the notion of ZTC, the zero textbook cost idea, it's so easy to understand. It's so persuasive. It speaks to politicians so clearly, right? I think there are possible futures in which ZTC programs really do become ubiquitous. And if that were to happen, if the majority of colleges and universities had ZTC programs, then the scenario becomes a really legitimate risk, that the funding that is used to maintain and update OER over time dries up. And according to the last Babson survey, where they asked this question, about 1 in 5 faculty already worry about OER not being updated and maintained actively, and they list that as an obstacle to adopting OER. So even with the way things are working now, this is a concern that faculty already have. And this momentum toward programs that prohibit students from being able to spend money, I think just makes that worse. And if the answer to the question of what happens when those infrastructure level kind of providers go away, if the answer is, well, our campus has an open textbook grant program, I just feel like that's probably not a great answer. Most of these programs give faculty a single faculty member, or in some cases a small team of faculty, $2,500, $5,000, $7,500, and they don't give them any instructional design support. And so here you're back again in a situation where you've got people with high level of subject matter expertise, but very likely very low instructional design expertise, with kind of a handful of money and a semester or two to do the work that's currently being done by a team of 70 or 80 people with quite a bit of funding behind it. I don't think this is the model that replaces that work if it goes away. Second challenge, prioritizing student learning with OER. When you look at the choices that OpenStax and OLI and Lumen have made, why these products? Why offer these products instead of offering something else? And the answer, if you talk to anybody from any of these organizations, they'll all tell you universally, is because they don't just care about reducing costs, they actually want to improve student learning. And the number one thing that you can do to improve student learning is provide them with lots of practice opportunities, give them good feedback, immediate feedback preferably, on that practice, and then let them practice again, right? We learn by doing. And because we understand the power of this practice and immediate feedback, that's the direction that these organizations and many others have gone, right? Is looking at these kind of courseware-based homework system, math system kinds of offerings. And there are a number of studies you can read along these lines. I think the Katinger one from 2016 is really terrific. Katinger shows across 4 different courses, 12,000 students, the learning effect of doing what they call online interactive practice. the learning effect of doing that is 6 times greater than of reading or of watching video, right? So that's why you see so many organizations going in this direction. Now, as this research more of it is coming out, it's better understood, more people are moving this way. And then we have, zero textbook cost programs that come in and say, no, you cannot adopt these kinds of materials. You can't even ask students to buy them because there's a cost associated with them. And we are zealous about the number 0, right? 0 textbook costs. It feels a bit like we're taking our eye off the road here, right? We should be focused on improving student learning, and certainly affordability is an important part of the idea of student learning. You can't learn from materials that you can't afford, right? But the zealousness around getting to 0, I think, has become a distraction. And I think it's a distraction that is putting student learning at risk. And I think it's one that's going to serve OER, as long as OER and ZTC get used synonymously, which they frequently do today. People will say, all our OER program, blah, 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 our ZTC program, and they're talking about the same thing. Right? As long as those two things are linked together in people's minds, the way that you get to 0 most often is you get to 0 with a PDF, which everybody can download, doesn't cost anything, you can use it offline, really easy. But if the technology that we're championing in 2022 is a PDF download that's static, that can't do these kind of practice with feedback types of things that we're talking about, it starts to feel like a kind of backward position pretty quickly. And I think it's hard to justify, it's more important to be 0 and not have some of these features that support better student learning than it is to be at 25 or 35 or what some of the numbers we were looking at back here were. I mean, eminently more affordable than the, I will just go out on a limb and say, immorally inappropriate amount that you'd pay for like in my math lab or something like that. But the insistence on 0 is problematic. So challenges for OER going forward. This idea, the 0 textbook cost program makes materials free no matter the cost to student learning, no matter the cost to the ecosystem of orgs that create and maintain the infrastructure kind of OER. And this is a problem. It's a challenge that I think there are interesting opportunities for us to take on and think about, particularly in the context of these collaborations between faculty, people with instructional design expertise. If you have the kind of good fortune and even broader team with more kinds of expertise that can be brought to bear. But as you think about that collaboration that you might have, whichever side of this collaboration you'd be on, as you think about the partner that you might talk to about this, how would you think about making sure that student learning remains the top priority and that you don't let affordability take over, so that you're pushing affordability even to the detriment of student learning? And how can we be involved and engaged in sustaining and maintaining OER over the long term? That's a couple of challenges for OER. Let me say something about an opportunity for OER around sustaining and maintaining OER in order to improve student learning. OER give us permission to make changes to them, but they don't have anything to say about what we should change or how we should change it. On the other hand, learning analytics, which is making its first appearance in the presentation here, learning analytics can help us determine which course materials aren't supporting student learning effectively, which materials need improving, but they can't give us permission to make those improvements. So you've got kind of half of the equation with OER and the other half with learning analytics, and we need to bring those together in some way. And I just have to pause for a moment and say, if you don't remember these great old Reese's peanut butter cup commercials, you should go on YouTube and look them up because they're hysterical, and they're there in abundance. But this idea that there's a chocolate to OER and a peanut butter to learning analytics, and when we put those two things together, we get this kind of Reese's peanut butter cup of continually improving, constantly more effective OER, is something that I think is super interesting. So I want to share a specific example of what I mean by that. And this is an example that's specific to us at Lumen and the way we do things. And I'm not necessarily trying to persuade you that the way we do things is the best way. I just want to talk you start to finish through an example so you get a sense for what I mean. So in our case at Lumen, one of the things that we're kind of obsessive about doing is aligning everything with learning outcomes, aligning readings, interactives, videos, practice, assessment items, aligning those all with learning outcomes, specifically so that, you know, when you're taking that summative assessment and you miss an item or two or three, I want to be able to chase from that assessment item that you were unable to demonstrate mastery on up to the learning outcome to see which learning outcome that assessment item was supposedly assessing you on, and then from the outcome be able to fan back out to see what kind of material had I provided to you that was supposed to prepare you to succeed on that assessment, right? So I can get from your failure on a little cluster of items that are all related to a single learning outcome, I can get from there back to the specific materials, the specific practice, the specific formative assessment that was supposed to prepare you for success right there, okay? And so in our case, we take those data and we lay them out. Here's another 2x2 grid kind, and look at engagement with aligned materials on the horizontal or the x-axis and performance on aligned assessment items on the vertical or the y. And as you might expect, I think everyone's default hypothesis is that there's an up and to the right relationship here. If you don't study, if you don't read, if you don't do the practice, if you don't engage with the materials, we also expect that you're not going to demonstrate mastery when you go to work on the assessments. And the more engaged you are, the more of the reading and the practice and the video watching and the interactives, the more engaged you are in studying, in using the material, the better that you'll do. That up and to the right hypothesis, I think, is kind of where everybody's intuition is. There are some cases where you'll see people have high performance even though they have low engagement, and this could indicate something like, maybe I had this class in high school, and I had a lot of prior knowledge coming in, so I'm able to do well on the assessments even without engaging the materials a lot. But we're particularly interested in this bottom right-hand quadrant, where students are doing all the things we're asking them to do in terms of reading the readings, using the practice, doing the formative assessments, watching the videos, whatever that might be. If they're doing all of the things we've asked them to do and they're unable to demonstrate mastery, then that's not their fault, that's the OER's fault at that point. And so this analysis, we do by taking every learning outcome in a course and just plotting it out on this grid. And so, for example, just to pick an outcome like this outcome right here, for this outcome, students engaged with all the materials aligned with that learning outcome more than they did the average material. This would be the average level of engagement here. Here's the average level of performance on aligned assessments. So here we see students are engaged more than average with the materials aligned with this outcome, and yet they're performing well below average on the assessments aligned with this outcome. So whatever that outcome is, I should go look at the OER for that because people are using it and it is not getting the job done. And we call this RISE analysis. And there's an article and some open source software, an open access article and some open source software that we've released around RISE analysis if you're interested in that. So an example of what that might look like and how that plays out to the end is RISE analysis might bring us to this OER about price ceilings. And now the RISE analysis won't tell you what's wrong. Right? It just identifies where you need to go and look. And so we'd come to this and look at it and say, there's a lot going on in this graph, actually. And we know that a lot of the students that we're serving, we're particularly interested in first generation students, Black students, Latino students, low income students, community college students is a lot of our focus. You may not come to this material with the highest level of visual literacy, or at least with a sufficient level of visual literacy to be able to figure out what's going on in that graph. And is that your fault? No. It's our fault for providing a graph that's just too complicated. So looking at this material, we might find this, zero in on that graph and say, what can we do to better support student learning of this material that's supposed to be kind of summarized by this visualization? And one thing that you can do, and what we did do here, is we take that graph that has a lot of stuff going on in it and strip it back just to its most essential parts. In this case, a supply curve, a demand curve, and an equilibrium point where they intersect. Ask students just about that part of it give them immediate feedback, and not just feedback that they're right or that they're wrong, but tell them why. Give them a chance to retry that problem until they're confident that they know what this part of the graph is saying, and then build the graph up over time with increasing complexity, ask more questions, give them more feedback along the way, until finally we get them to the point where they're able to look at that whole graph and actually understand what's going on because we've built it up in a scaffolded way for them. Now, given the digital nature of OER, it's comparatively simple to run really large-scale randomized controlled trials or A/B tests to see if the changes that you've made to your OER are changes or if they're actually improvements, right? And so just to give you an example here, last year we did an A/B test with a little over 34,000 students at a little over 200 institutions here in the US, where we saw that a revised version of some course content presented in a new way not only outperformed the original, but outperformed the original version in a way that led to statistically significant gain in student performance on the assessment. This is exactly the kind of thing that we're looking for, right? The analysis of the data help us find a weakness in the courseware where things aren't working the way they should. We go and look at that, do some analysis using instructional design expertise to say, why isn't this getting the job done? Come up with a new hypothesis about changes we can make to the course materials, but at this point, they're only changes. Then put them in the field to try them out and find out whether or not they actually are improvements. And I would say a mantra for you to remember when you think about the 5 R's in OER is that it's very easy to make changes. It's really hard to make improvements. So hard, in fact, that you may have seen, we've been talking about this quite a bit on social media, done a couple of webinars. We actually have a grant program dedicated to this that we're running right now at Lumen, where learning outcomes that we identify as being particularly challenging, by which I mean the OER is really underperforming. Just a single outcome's worth of content, so a fraction of a page worth of OER, where we're doing a grant program now to do small grants, $250 grants for people who propose changes and a rationale around those changes for why they think a new version of OER might be more effective than what is currently there. And then once those changes are submitted, we'll roll those out in our A/B testing machinery. And at the end of the next semester, go back and look to see if those changes actually were improvements. And if they're improvements, if they statistically significantly improve student learning on that outcome, then it's a 10x cash bonus of $2,500 if your change isn't just a change, but it's truly an improvement. So if you're interested in that, just to come back to this idea of the collaboration again, you have a dramatically better chance of winning that bonus if you collaborate. If you get someone who really knows the subject matter and somebody who really knows their learning science to get together to propose and to work on improvements. Now, let's go in the other order for OEP. We'll talk about the opportunity first and challenge second. And again, agreeing on terms. What do I mean when I say OEP? When I say OEP, I'm talking about OER-enabled pedagogy. I'm not talking about open educational practices or open pedagogy or a bunch of other related terms, but terms which honestly, as far as I can tell, have no definition or no agreed upon definition. When I say OER-enabled pedagogy, what I mean is the set of teaching and learning practices that are only possible or practical when you have the 5 R permissions. Okay, they're the things that you can do when you have 5 Rs, things you can do when you're using OER. That's what OER-enabled means. Now, what on earth, if OER is OER due to its copyright status, what does copyright have to do with pedagogy? Well, I hope at this point that there's not a lot of argument left about whether or not we learn by doing. I'm going to take it as a given that we learn by doing. I'm also going to take it as a given that copyright restricts us from doing certain things without the permission of the rights holder. That's what copyright does. It puts up barriers to certain uses so that we'll go license those uses from the rights holder. They make money. They have an incentive to produce more creative works. That's how it's supposed to work in theory. But if we learn by doing, And if the function of copyright is to restrict what we're able to do or what we're permitted to do, then copyright restricts the way that we're able to learn, because it says there are certain things you could do that are out of bounds. So open licenses and the OER that become OER when open licenses are applied to them give us permission to do those things that copyright normally restricts us from doing. So OER make it possible for us to learn in new ways, because they give us permission to do things we couldn't do before, and we learn by doing. That's the relationship there. So you've probably heard me talk about disposable assignments before. These are assignments that students reluctantly do, that you reluctantly grade. If you're being completely honest, you might grade them while you're watching a football game. You give them back to the students, and the students, without even looking at the feedback, just throw them straight into the garbage can, because it's understood by everyone involved that where that assignment is going to end up is the garbage can. That's its destiny. It's a disposable assignment. My colleague John Hilton and I have done some writing about, how can we take disposable assignments and turn them into something a little more useful. And in that writing, we tried to connect to this idea of authentic work, authentic assessment, constructionist kind of work like Seymour Papert might have envisioned, and finally what we call renewable assignments here at the bottom. So the idea with the renewable assignment is you have a student creating an artifact. That's the first step. That artifact has some value beyond simply supporting that student's learning. It has the opportunity or the possibility of some greater kind of life out in the world. That artifact is made public. That's the kind of constructionist piece. And then to be a renewable assignment, that artifact is openly licensed so that other students, other teachers, other people can build on it in the future. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about a renewable assignment. And two specific examples of that. I think the quintessential example here is either co-creating or co-remixing OER together with your students. So if you've heard me talk about this before, you've probably heard me talk about these two examples. One, project management for instructional designers, which was a course I used to teach when I was still full-time as a faculty member. There was no project management book written specifically for instructional designers, but I needed one. And doing all the work myself of trying to take an existing open textbook about project management written for business school students and turn that into a book written for instructional designers seemed like more work than I wanted to take on. And it was then that I realized this is a perfect opportunity to work together to co-create, co-remix, co-revise some existing OER. And so over the course of a couple of semesters when I taught the course, and then additional work has been done by other faculty, by Royce Kimmons and others at BYU who've continued to teach this course and take it forward with their students, where the assignments for the class are to go into the official required course materials and edit them together in a small group, and bring those edits back and report on them from time to time in class, where we'll do stand up and have each team stand up and talk about the progress that they've made. And man, the students come up. If you give students agency, well, this is just a general principle. If you give students agency, amazing things will always happen. If you give them agency with regard to OER, which gives them even more agency than they might have otherwise, I let students propose the kinds of changes that they wanted to make to the textbook over time. And so one group of students would go through, say, and take every little yellow background box with a case study in it, and they'd pull that case study out and they'd write a whole new case study to go in. And when you think about a case study, it has to exemplify all the principles that are being described, that it's supposed to be a case study for. So it's actually reflective of a lot of really good kind of integrated, synthesized learning to write that kind of case study. So students did a lot of this kind of work. They presented in class. They'd see what each other were doing. Instead of grading work that I knew was going to get thrown away, at that point, I know now that I'm kind of the editor of work that students are doing that's eventually going to make its way into this textbook and stay there, and other students are going to be able to use it in the future. And when students know that the work they're doing is going to be seen by their peers, and is potentially going to be used by other students down the line, then they engage in that work in an entirely different way. And for the sake of time, I'm going to skip the second example, but just kind of summarize here by saying that these renewable assignment type of OER-enabled pedagogies really dramatically increase student engagement, because everyone wants to feel like their work their work matters. And sometimes we forget that students are people, and nobody likes to do tons of work that you know is just going to be thrown away. You might think about some committee assignments you've had in the past where maybe you had that feeling. Everyone wants to feel like their work matters. Public accountability can be a super powerful motivator. Depending on the dynamic in any given class where you do this kind of work, you might get a little competition to see, whose contributions are going to be the most valuable. That can be super productive. But this kind of work can also contribute to the sustainability and maintenance of OER over time, because you're in there doing work. You're doing work to make changes that you hope are improvements. Now, the challenge for OEP is exactly the flip side of that, right? Around sustaining and maintaining, because the quintessential OEP is co-creating and co-remixing OER with students. And as we said a minute ago, the majority of faculty have very little, if any, training in instructional design, and that's not their fault. We don't provide it to them, right? When you do your PhD in physics or in economics or something else, even though the likelihood is very high that as a PhD, you're going to go be a faculty member somewhere and teach, we don't require you to take even a single 3-credit course in effective teaching. So for the overwhelming majority of faculty, their instructional design training is probably limited to a workshop they went to over the lunch hour, or a handful of those that they've been to over the years. And again, it's not to blame anything on faculty, it's more an indictment of the way that we prepare faculty as institutions of higher ed. And of course, students typically know even less about evidence-based teaching and learning strategies than their faculty do. So, it's very easy to see if you're in, doing some revising and remixing, you make a very obvious visual error like the one that I've made here. Pretty much anybody can see that. They can tell that something's wrong, they can correct that and make it right again. But what happens when there's no one who's either involved in designing the assignment, completing the assignment, or grading the assignment, who can see instructional design, right? That's much harder to see than whether text is laying over top of an image or not. If it's not something you're used to looking for, it'd be really easy to mess up an expanding rehearsal schedule. It'd be really easy to say that interactive retrieval practice, that looks too annoying. I think a video would be more engaging there. Or these metacognitive supports, they're not even related to economics. That's wasted time that students are spending on something other than my course, my discipline. I'm going to remove that. It's very easy when you can't see the instructional design. It's very easy to break the most effective parts of OER and not even realize that you've done it, because you did it because you can't see it, because you don't know what the telltale signs are of these different kinds of teaching and learning strategies and how they show up. So, to summarize, I think there are lots of opportunities and lots of challenges ahead for OER and for OEP. I hope I've tried to thread those together. It's only an hour, right? There's only so much we can talk about. But I do think that these two notions of how do we move forward with OER and OEP in a way that puts the first priority on student learning and never makes that trade-off that says, I'm willing to have students pay a little less if they'll learn a little less. How do we keep learning our top priority? How do we think about sustaining and maintaining OER over the long term so that students 5 years from now or 10 years from now can not only get the same level of benefit that today's students are getting, but hopefully thanks to continuous improvement and other things like that, they're actually getting even more benefit than today's students were. How do we make sure that these benefits are enduring and stable and that they're growing over time, that student learning is improving? And just to kind of tie this together with the theme of the conference around innovation and innovation post-COVID, what could be more innovative than an actual productive, healthy partnership between faculty and instructional designers that improves student learning and saves students money by using OER and OEP. You might say, well, it could be more innovative if you had even more people on the team. Well, maybe I'll cede that to you. But it seems so obvious, and yet it's so rare to see in our institutions a real long-term productive partnership between someone on the teaching staff and someone on the Center for Teaching and Learning staff. And I hope that I've encouraged you a little bit to think about ways that you can engage in those kind of collaborations and given you some interesting questions to talk about with your partner in those collaborations and some food for thought as we go forward here.